Let's understand pseudo-classes, starting with hover. In order to show you hover, let's create a div inside of HTML with the class of container. Now that we have that class, we are going into CSS. We are going to target our container. We'll give it a width of 100 pixels, a height of 100 pixels, and a background color of yellow, for example. To use the hover pseudo class, we are again going to target our container, but this time followed by a colon and the hover pseudo class. And by using this syntax, you're going to use the hover pseudo class. Now again, opening and closing brackets, and inside of this container, we can basically define the things that should change once we hover over the element. So in our case, let's say once we hover over the element, we want to have a different background color of maybe aqua. We are going to save our document. We are going to hover over the yellow element. And as you can see, we now have an aqua background. We could obviously also change the width, for example, once we hover to 150 pixels and the height to 150 pixels, for example. Like this, and now once we hover, the height and the width should also change, and as you can see, it does. So hover defines what is going to happen once you hover over an element. The next pseudo class works for links, for example, so let's create a link to take a look at it. Let's say we have a link to Google, for example, and we're going to target the link by using the a tag, and now we can add the active pseudo class by using :active. So the syntax is pretty similar to the hover pseudo class. The only difference is that you have active instead of hover right here. Now we use opening and closing brackets once again, and we can say that we want to have a background color of brown, for example, once our link becomes active. And you'll see what active means once I click the link. And now I'm going to click it. You can see the background color is getting brown. And once I release the click, the background color turns to white again. So active basically means what is going to happen once the element is active. So once the link is clicked, for example. So let's take a look at focus next. But before, we can remove this code. And we'll remove this code inside of HTML as well. And in order to really understand focus, we are going to add an input field of type text, for example. Now we'll target this input field by using the input selector, and we'll add the focus pseudo class by using :focus. And the focus pseudo class defines what is going to happen once the element becomes focused. Once I click inside of this input element, the input element becomes focused. And right now you can see once the input element becomes focused, we have an outline around the input element. So let's say we want to remove that outline, for example, because that is something you really want to do pretty often. So let's say we have an outline of none once the user clicks inside of the input field. So let's click inside of the input field, and now we don't have an outline anymore. So let's say we also want to have a background color of probably blue, which would look terrible, but to visualize it, I think this works pretty good. And now we are going to click into the input field and we have a blue background. So this is how focused works. Let's take a look at the visited pseudo class. And in order to do so, we are going to create an anchor tag again, and that anchor tag is going to go to Google, for example. So we need the link to Google. We are going to get the link to Google by going to Google ourselves. Then we are going to copy that link. Basically, we are going to put it into the href. We are going to use target equals _blank to open it in a new tab. And now we'll target our anchor tag by using a:visited. And we'll define a background color once we visited the link. So we'll say our background color once the link is basically visited is going to be brown. And if the link has not been visited yet, our background color is going to be white. And once we save, we basically see that we already visited that link, so the background color is going to be blue. So let me copy my YouTube link in here, and as you can see, we didn't visit YouTube yet, so not my channel at least. So the background color of Google, which is actually my YouTube link, so we can actually change that to YouTube, for example. And once I click on this link, we'll land on my YouTube page, and the link will have a background color of brown. So let's test that. We're going to click the link. We're going to land. My internet is terrible right now, so yeah, that might take forever, but you can see we actually loaded my YouTube page, and now our link has a background color of brown right now. So this is actually also working. So visited just defines how something should look after you visited it, basically. So let's close my channel page after you subscribed. So to understand first child, we are going into our HTML file. We're going to create a div, and inside of this div, we are going to create 2 paragraphs. Each of these paragraphs has some placeholder text of 5 words, for example. And then we're going to take this div, copy this div a second time, and this time we'll have an h1, at the top, for example, or let's say nh2. We'll have some placeholder text as well, and we'll have a second h2 at the bottom, for example. So this is the first div and this is the second div. And let's give this div a class of cont1 and the second div a class of cont2. And let's style those containers just to have a visualization to differentiate them. So that is cont1. Let's copy that. Let's say cont2 has a background color of whatever, maybe some green. And now we have those two containers basically. So the first container basically has two paragraphs. The second container has two h2 elements and two paragraphs. So let's target the paragraphs inside. And we can do so by using p colon followed by first child, for example. And I think it's easier to understand once you just see the difference. So we're going to give the first child of the p tag basically a background color of, let's say, green, for example. So now our first p element inside of our first container has a background color of green. So why is that? The reason for this is that when it comes to having p tag siblings, colon first child will always select the first child of something. And since the p tag is the first child of this div, first child will basically select this p tag and give it a background color of green. If you go into this div, for example, the first child is the h2 tag and not the p tag. Therefore, this p tag and this p tag will not get a background color of green, for example. So colon first child always targets the first child, in our case, the first p tag, that is the first child of something, and give that one the defined styles. So let's say we want to have the last p tag, for example. So let's use p colon last child. And let's give that one a font size, for example, of 10. So that one is going to be pretty small now. And as you can see, the last child inside of the div right here will have a font size of 10. So if we would remove this h2 element, for example, our last p tag should also have a pretty small font size once we saved. And as you can see, I saved, and now our last p tag inside of this container has also a pretty small font size, because that is the last child inside of the container as well now. Another option is to use nth-child, and in order to do so, we are going to duplicate our paragraph inside our first container a couple of times. And now let's use p colon nth-child. And now we can use opening and closing brackets, but here we also need some brackets, and inside of these brackets we can define how many children we want to select. So I'm going to remove that first of all to see the difference. And now we can say we want to use that defined styles on every second child, for example. So let's use 2n, and that is basically the syntax to define the amount of childs we want to target. 2n basically means use every second child. And now let's give that child a background color of blue, for example. And as you can see, every second p tag, every second child that is a p tag basically, will have a background color of blue. We could also say let's do that for every third child, and we're going to save. And as you can see, we did the same for every third child. We could also do it for every child. Now every p tag has a background color of blue, and we can also use even, and now we will have every second child. And instead of even, we could also use odd to select the odd numbers. So let's delete that, and let's take a look at disabled, required, and checked. First of all, to use the checked pseudo class, we need to use a checkbox. So we're going to create an input of type checkbox, and let's just save the document. Now we just have this input, and let's say once our input is basically checked, we want to have a width of 100 pixels and a height of 100 pixels. So that should be a pretty big difference. Now I'm going to check it, and as you can see, we have a pretty big input. Next, let's take a look at disabled. So let's create an input field that is disabled, so input of type text, for example, and let's add the disabled attribute. Now we have a disabled input field, and let's say once our input is disabled, we add a background color of black, for example. And as you can see, now our disabled input field has a background color of black. Next, we can also target an input field that has the required attribute, for example. So let's add an input field of type text again, and let's add the required attribute again to this input field. And now we can also target this input field of type required, and we can say we want to have a background color of bisq, for example, for that required field. And as you can see, we now have a background color of bisq for the input field with the attribute of required. And that is all you need to know about pseudo classes in CSS.